So, tonight we're going to discuss Joab. And the reason we're going to discuss Joab is, as we mentioned at the beginning of this quarter, doing 1st and 2nd Samuel, you guys have probably heard a lot about David, Saul, and Samuel. They're the primary characters in the book. One of them has the book named after him, even though he probably didn't live to 2nd Samuel anyway, because at the end of 1st Samuel he dies. So, I feel pretty confident in saying he didn't write the second one, but it still gets his name. Having said that, there are some characters in these books that we just don't talk much about. Sure, we mention the stories that they're in. We maybe make a comment or two along the way. But what I'd like to do tonight is actually focus on a character that we very rarely talk about, because I think there are some things that we can learn from his mistakes, more so than necessarily from him. I will begin by saying this. Joab is, at least generally speaking, not a good guy in this book. Okay? However, there are some character traits of his that we could learn something from. Second of all, you can learn just as much from what the bad people are doing as you can from what the good people are doing, because if there's anything I like, it's watching somebody else make a mistake so I don't have to also make it. I think that's the way a lot of us hope that we can parent, is that we went ahead and made the mistakes so our kids wouldn't have to. I know I've made a few of mine that I hope my kids don't repeat. So, we're going to look at Joab in that context, but to begin with, I'll ask this question. Who was Joab? Y'all are going to have to work with me. We're going fast tonight. He was the captain of the army, commander of the army, absolutely. What else was he? David's nephew. What else do we know about him? He's a schemer. Okay, we're going to talk about one of his schemes in particular tonight. What else? He was good at what he did. He had one job and he did it really well. So well, in fact, he was a bit of a workaholic with regard to his job. We'll talk about that as well. What else do you know about him? Let's do this. Was he a mighty man? That first title is in all caps, so you're kind of wondering, do you mean mighty men like 2 Samuel 23 mighty men, or just a mighty man in general? One interesting thing in 2 Samuel 23, if you'll take a look right up here, we're going to highlight, I don't know if you can see my pointer, but it's right there. Okay? Joab's brothers are mentioned among David's mighty men of 2 Samuel 23, but Joab's not. But there's another interesting thing about that passage. It says there's a first three, and it names them. Then it says there's a second three, and only names 2 people. Where's the third? I assume the prophet could count to 3. He did it in the prior passages. What happened to him? There is at least a theory out there. I'm not going to tell you it's necessarily mine, but there's at least a theory out there that there were 2 sets of 3, but there's 3 and 2 because somebody got deleted. Now, that's not to say that Scripture is in any way incomplete. It's not what I'm trying to say. I'm saying that the people of Jewish history, in particular, those who, you guys are familiar with the phrase, those who win the wars write the history books. Okay? Joab's going to end on a particularly low note, and we'll get to that at the end of tonight's class. But what you will find is that Joab is David's nephew. That came up over here a minute ago. He has 2 brothers, Abishai and Asahel. They both come up in the list of mighty men. Now, Joab was their boss, but doesn't. I find that kind of interesting. He was commander of the army, if nothing less. So I'll end with just this. Oh, by the way, his armor bearer also shows up in 37. So not only do both of his brothers and the guy that carries his stuff show up in the list of mighty men, but he's excluded for some reason or other, which again, I would contest as a case of the Jews looking back at their history a little bit. And I put down here in the little asterisk, only 2 of 3 named among the another 3 in verses 18 to 23, so feel free to go check that if you would like. But one other little interesting tidbit here. Who is Zeruiah? Well, we said that Joab is David's nephew. That's David's sister. She has 3 sons recorded in Scripture, and all 3 of them were particularly good warriors. So, go mom. For some reason or other, the genetics were really strong on that side of the family. Okay? You'll find that Absalom and his younger brother, Ishbosheth, who assumes to take over the kingdom, were both really pretty. So apparently good traits ran in families. So the really pretty ones came out of this side, and then the really fighting ones came out of that side. Just an interesting point if you want to look at that. But, one of the little interesting tidbit here. Who is Zeruiah? Well, we said that Joab is David's nephew. That's David's sister. She has 3 sons recorded in Scripture, and all 3 of them were particularly good warriors. So, go mom. For some reason or other, the genetics were really strong on that side of the family. Okay? You'll find that Absalom and his younger brother, Ishbosheth, who assumes to take over the kingdom, were both really pretty. So apparently good traits ran in families. So the really pretty ones came out of this side, and then the really fighting ones came out of that side. Just interesting point if you want to look at that. But What I will say about Joab is he was still a mighty warrior, whether he was specifically a, quote, mighty man or not. He became commander of all the army of Israel after the conquest of the Jebusites, or specifically the hill of Zion, which became Jerusalem. It was called the city of David in 1 Chronicles chapter 11. After David said, whoever can go in and win this city will be commander of the army. And Joab said, deal. And indeed he did. So that's how he became commander of the army. Challenge was issued and he accepted. He was good at what he did. Right, Jimmy? But this is the end of his story. It's in 1 Kings, which I understand is outside the scope of this class, but I do want to read these two verses. David, in the latter stages of his life, on his deathbed, tells Solomon this in 1 Kings chapter 2, verses 5 and 6. Moreover, you know also what Joab the son of Zeruiah did to me. That's one thing. What he did to the two commanders of the armies of Israel, to Abner the son of Ner, that's a second thing, and Amasa the son of Jether, that's a third thing, whom he killed. And, really important phrase right here, he shed the blood of war in peacetime, and put the blood of war on his belt that was around his waist and on his sandals that were on his feet. Verse 6, therefore do according to your wisdom, and do not let his gray hair go down to the grave in peace. What is David telling Solomon? Kill him. If you are indeed wise, according to your wisdom, don't let him live. Why was that? Just like a Hollywood movie. There's the ending. Why do we get there? He killed Abner when he wasn't supposed to. And again, it's right there in the verses preceding. Yes, sir. There's some extent where it could have gone to his head, sure. In both those cases, Abner and Amasa, they were in peace. They may have previously been his enemies, but he could not distinguish friend from foe, particularly if the friend was a former foe. Both Abner and Amasa were previously his enemies, and we'll study both those stories in the context of tonight's class. But when they made alliance with David, Joab just could not accept that. We'll get there. We'll get there. Because he tells David he came in peace, he is told that Abner was allowed to go in peace, and he says, don't you know he's a spy? He came here to deceive you, and so on. So David tells him, I've made peace with this guy, but he rejects that peace.
I don't think we're explicitly told this, but when you just sit down and read the whole thing through, you really get the sense that Joab's trying to position himself to take over the throne.
There was a phrase that came up in some of the things I was reading where Joab kind of perceived himself as a kingmaker, if you will, which is really going to be his undoing toward the end of this story. Quit stealing my future points. I did. Shame on you. Absolutely, he took things into his own hands. As a matter of fact, I didn't put this in the slides because I didn't think I'd have enough time, and I really don't, but I guess we're going to talk about it anyway. In Judges, it says two separate times, there was no king in Israel, therefore, what? In those days, there was no king in Israel, therefore everyone did what was right in his own eyes. What is there at the time of David's reign? Louder. Yeah, a king. As a matter of fact, sometimes they had multiple. We're in the time of the kings. Joab's still doing what's right in his own eyes. Now, it was always wrong. Judges is telling you it was wrong when there was no king, but at least it's putting it in a historical context. Joab's still living that lifestyle. Maybe a king in Israel, but this is what seems right to me. Which is why, again, when David could make peace with his enemies, Joab could not. Now, David, we said in, I believe, your class last week, or 2 weeks ago maybe, was colloquially known as what? The man after God's own heart. You think maybe one aspect of David being the man after God's own heart was his willingness to show mercy and make peace with his enemies? What did he do when he found one survivor of Saul's house? Took care of him the rest of his life. That's pretty cool, right? What was Saul? His enemy, right? He was the Lord's anointed, but Saul spent the latter half of his life pursuing David. Only for Mephibosheth, who was a cripple, to be welcomed into David's house. Second of all, again, these two guys that get killed up here, David makes peace with. Now, we'll talk about their stories as we get to them. And again, if I don't start going faster in these slides, we're not going to get to them. Joab, disrupting peace early and often. This is pretty much his life. He is very good at war. He is awful at peace. Let's begin war with Saul's house. 2 Samuel chapter 2. Ishbosheth, Saul's son, after his death, presumes to be king. And he's made the king over northern Israel. Now, I specified northern Israel for the simple fact that David was king over Judah from the beginning. Now, we always talk about the period of the divided kingdom being after Solomon's death. However, there are a couple of occasions in 1 and 2 Samuel where the kingdom is divided. Now, it's not the divided kingdom as in it doesn't ever get reunited again, but the northern tribes follow Ishbosheth while Judah follows David. Now, Abner is the commander of Saul's army. Saul, again, was at war with David, so Abner places Ishbosheth in charge of the northern tribes. And then he makes war with David. And there's some interesting stories in chapter 2. We're not going to go into all the details of it, but here's one part of it. Joab leading David's army, Abner leading Saul, or Ishbosheth now's army, is being pursued. And Abner has Asahel. Now, who was he? Joab's brother. And it says in verses 18 through 23 that he was fast like a deer. Okay? He could fly. And he's chasing Abner. Now, what happens when fast people chase not quite so fast people? They catch them. And so as Abner's running away, he says, turn aside and grab one of the younger men and put on some armor. Which basically what he's telling is, I know you're going to catch me, but when you get here, there's going to be a fight. Maybe put on some armor. But Asahel ignores him. Continues to pursue him. 2 separate times, Abner says, turn aside and chase someone else. He's warning him. You're not going to like what you catch. You ever seen a dog chase a car? You ever seen a dog catch a car? Oh, I've seen a dog catch a car. I've had a dog catch my truck a couple times. Does it go well when the dog catches the car? Doesn't go well when Asahel catches Abner either. Abner takes the blunt end of his spear and stabs it through him. And it came out the other side. The blunt end. That's a hard way to go down. I can't even imagine. But that's what Scripture says. It also says something about how fast Asahel was running. You got to be real fast to make the blunt end of a stick go through you. So, Abner warned him twice not to pursue him any further, and he did it anyway, and when he caught him, he didn't like what he caught, like a dog chasing a car. Now, Joab and Abishai find their brother. Can you imagine how they feel? Not particularly happy. Now, Joab ceases the pursuit in verses 24 through 28 because Abner calls out to him and says, how long will you continue chasing your brothers? Because again, northern Israel, southern Israel, they're still all Israel. But Joab says, had you not said anything, I'd have chased you till tomorrow morning, but I'll call off the battle. So he rows back. His brother's dead, though. Here's what happens. Peace is going to be made with Saul's house because Ishbosheth does not know when to keep his mouth shut. Ishbosheth, Saul's son, says that Abner slept with his father's concubine. This is an adult class. That's as far as I will go in that particular story. It was not a true story according to Abner. He is furious with Ishbosheth over this accusation, and he says, because you accused me of this, I will rally everyone to David. So in verses 8 through 11, he does that. David makes a covenant beginning in verse 13 with Abner. Now, Jimmy, to your point, I guess it's possible that Joab doesn't know that, but he does come to the city after Abner departs, and he is told that peace has been made with Abner in those verses, 13 through 21. And Joab goes to David and says, don't you know that he's a spy, and he came here to deceive you, to see you're going out and going in? Because Joab, again, he's a warrior. He understands how wars work. He doesn't realize that when peace has been made, the war is over. He's still in battle mode. And again, I got to think he's a little bit jaded. Because what did Abner do to his brother again? Killed him. Yes, sir. I'm going to get up to the Avenger of Blood in a minute. You and Becky are killing me tonight. The Avenger of Blood is here. But again, David has said he's made peace, and David is going to curse him for what he does. David makes covenant with Abner. Enter Joab in chapter 3. He claims Abner was just a spy in verses 22 through 25, and he kills Abner, and it says to avenge his brother Asahel in verses 26 and 27. Here's what David says in response to that. My kingdom and I are guiltless before the Lord forever of the blood of Abner the son of Ner. Let it rest on the head of Joab and on all his father's house. Now, whether or not he had the right to avenge him comes down to a couple of things in Numbers. And I do have a slide for that here in just a little bit. So let's put a pin in that thought just for a second if we can. Okay? Here's the second thing that he did. And again, we're going fast because time. But if you have a comment, feel free to raise your hand or just start talking. I will pause for you for at least 10 seconds. Absalom's rebellion. What happened here? Well, one of David's sons, Amnon, what's the colloquial for? Sexually assaulted his sister, Tamar. Absalom is very upset about this point, so he lures Amnon away and murders him. Now, to your point, what should happen? Well, he should be put to death, avenger of blood, right? Who schemes to have him brought back? Joab hires a woman to go in to claim to be a mourner for the case of Absalom and says, bring him back, don't let the avenger of blood take him. It's this big whole ordeal. So David says, that's fine, he can come back, but he can never see my face. Okay? So David doesn't quite welcome him home, but he does let him come back, and he doesn't allow the old law to be carried out as far as the avenger of blood. Now, what happens over the course of the next few chapters is Absalom decides he's going to commit treason. He's going to rebel against the kingdom of his father. And so, he runs David out of town, and Joab goes with David. Now again, Joab bears some blame here, because Absalom was harmless and far off until Joab convinced David to bring him back. But now that he rebels, Joab's back on David's side. As a general rule, for every decision that Joab makes in his life, save one, he chooses David's side, or what he at least believes to be David's side. So, battle ensues. Absalom has warriors, David has warriors. There's a long story that plays out that maybe somebody else will cover in another class, or I know you've got like a bonus class at the end, maybe you'll cover that middle part. I'm not going to. What winds up happening is they come down to the day of battle, and David tells all three captains of his army. At this point, with Asahel dead, he has Abishai and Joab, and another guy whose name escapes me. It starts with an I. No, it starts with a B, and he's son of something that starts with an I. But anyway, sorry. I didn't write any notes, guys. I've just got the slides. All right. But despite David's command to his three captains, do not, for my sake, harm the man Absalom. They find Absalom hanging in a tree by his hair, which the Bible makes a point of telling you just how thick and heavy his hair was. I don't know. It's just in there. Okay? But it was thick enough and heavy enough to hold him in a tree. And a man finds him there and says, Joab, I found him in a tree. He says, why didn't you stab him? Well, because the king said to you in all of our hearing not to harm him. Joab says, I would have paid you to kill him yourself. But then Joab goes, he thrusts him through with 3 spears, and then all the rest of his men go ahead and play piñata with Absalom's body. Okay? Suffice to say, Joab was told at the beginning, reminded right before he did it, and killed Absalom anyway. So here's what happens. Oh, I got those 2 slides backwards. Well, suffice to say, here's the rest of the story we didn't cover. Okay? I repeated a few things here. Joab rebukes and threatens David in 2 Samuel 19. That's the part that I want to get to, is right here, this last point. Joab comes back to the city where David is, and when David receives the news that Absalom's been killed, he is absolutely distraught. He's beside himself. And it says the same thing repeatedly, oh, Absalom, my son, Absalom, my son. Scripture records that when David gets the news. He's still saying that when Joab gets back to town. Joab is furious because all the rest of the army, while David is doing that, Scripture says they stole into the city as those who retreat from battle. They're ashamed of themselves for having won because the king is mourning his son. So Joab, for the first time in his career, stands up to David in this way. 2 Samuel chapter 19, he says, if you don't go out and act like a king, you won't be one tomorrow. He says, if you do not go out and honor the men who risk their lives for you, because I perceive that if Absalom had survived and we had died, it would have suited you well. You don't know friend from foe. Such an ironic statement coming from Joab. But he accuses David of not knowing friend from foe and says, if you do not come out and sit in your seat and greet your soldiers, Tonight, no one will stay with you, and it will be the worst point of your life from your birth to now. Joab is threatening David with another rebellion, and I will lead this one. Pretty serious deal. So what does David do? David cleans up, goes out, sits in his seat, and everyone rejoices because the king is in his place. Now, you can like or hate the way that story goes. I tend to at least see a little bit of what Joab sees. It's not the rest of the army's fault that Joab did what he did. And Joab's saying you need to honor your men who went out and risked their lives on your behalf. At least has some merit to it. However, there is this. Joab did wrong, right? He was specifically told to not do what? Harm Absalom. What's the one thing he did? Harmed him repeatedly to the point of harming him to death. So yeah, I can see why David's upset too. David has, and again, this is all fallout from the David and Bathsheba story. God tells David through the prophet Nathan, the sword will never depart from your house. And so David, in the very next story, is Amnon and Tamar, Absalom and Amnon, the death of Absalom. It doesn't get better for David. God delivers on that promise. So, and that's a longer story than, again, I can cover in the next 14 minutes. But the thing I want everybody to take from this part right here is that during this rebellion, Joab has begun to show that he's not always on David's side. He doesn't always agree with David. He is not a yes man. You may plead ignorance in the case of Abner. You may point to the fact that Abner used to be his enemy, but David has never been Joab's enemy. And Joab is threatening him with that right now. There's a shift in Joab here where somebody pointed out he kind of wants to be a kingmaker. He wants to think more of himself than he should. This is the first time we see that shine through. Then there's Amasa. During that story we just talked about in Absalom's rebellion, Absalom has to have a commander of his own army. Joab is still David's commander. Amasa is Absalom's commander of his army. Now, peace has been made. Now that Absalom is dead, the rebellion falls apart. And so what David does, 2 Samuel 17:25 is where Absalom makes Amasa the commander of his army. In chapter 19, verse 13, David reaffirms Amasa as commander of all the army of Israel, which is taking over whose job? Joab's. Now, we talked earlier, Jimmy, about he's really good at his job. How do people that are really good at their job handle losing their job? They tend to not take it real well. Joab's from that camp. Okay? Unemployment does not suit him well. He's good at war. This war is over, and now someone else has been put in his place. So what will he do? Another rebellion turns up. And Amasa is told, go gather the army and meet me in 3 days. That's what David tells him to do. So he goes, and the scripture says that he did not meet David at the appointed time. He was late. So Joab, along with his brother, when they meet Amasa, Joab pulls him to the side, grabs him by the beard and stabs him all the way through. And it says his guts fell out on the road and he lays there wallowing in his own blood. Now again, he went, what the scripture says is, as if to give him a kiss. But he didn't give him a kiss. Did much, much worse. He knifed him right there. So, I've got 3 theories on why he did that. 1, he thought Amasa was still a rebellious leader, because Amasa had been Absalom's commander. There is a new rebellion started. You're told to go gather the troops, and you don't show up at the appointed time. For all we know, you joined the enemy. So when you turn up, I'm going to gut you. That's one. Second one, he's mad because he lost his job. This guy's commander of the army. That's supposed to be my job. If he's gone, it'll be my job again. There you go. Or, it's simply that he thought Amasa was incompetent. If David had sent me to raise the army and said meet in 3 days, I'd have been here in 3 days. Now, I want you to consider the logistical problem with that. Joab, if nothing else, has been commander of the forces for years at this point, and is well respected, and his armor bearer and both his brothers are part of the listed mighty men of David. Would he have had a problem convincing the soldiers to follow him? Generally not, no. But what about Amasa, who just got through leading the enemy? Would he have a little harder time convincing people to come out with him? It would seem, at least logistically, I could see why Amasa would have a hard time getting David's guys to come out and follow him because, hey, the last group that followed you, a guy got played piñata with swords. So I can see why Amasa may have tarried. I don't know if it was laziness or just the bad logistics or what. But for one of those three reasons, I think, if you've got a fourth, feel free to volunteer it, but for one of those three reasons, I think Joab felt like it was time to kill Amasa. Does anybody have an objection or fourth possible reason why he would have done it? Because he felt like it. That's planned. Okay, I can give you that. No doubt he felt like it. Why he felt like it, maybe one of those three. Jealousy plays a role here. I originally had longer points, but they ran to more than one line, and I ran out of slides, so that it got narrowed down to just those three with the very short words. So here's the question. Can you be right and still be wrong? I know we like to think, well, there's right and there's wrong. Can you be right and still be wrong? Does the end justify the means? Oh, so I could get to the right conclusion by the wrong avenue and it might still be wrong. Or I could get to the wrong conclusion by the right means and it might still be wrong. Told you I'd come back to it. Avenger of blood, Numbers 35. What does it say about the Avenger of blood? Max talked about it a little bit on Sunday morning. If he would have been here tonight, I think Max skips my class too. I think he's doing it on purpose. But Max talked about the Avenger of blood and how that worked. And there were cities of refuge, 3 on each side of the Jordan. What did the Avenger of blood do? So when a murder was committed in a time with no police force, the next of kin had the right to pursue and kill the murderer. Okay? If you kill part of my family, we will kill you back. Okay? That was pretty much Old Testament law. And so the question arises, under what context does that apply? Well, Numbers 35 is actually pretty clear about murder had to be premeditated, and manslaughter did not. So there was a distinction between the two when the Avenger of blood could and could not pursue and kill the murderer. So here's my question. Abner killed Joab's brother, right? Did he murder him? He did in full knowledge. Okay. What's the context? Okay. What's that? It was also in the middle of a battle. I want you to consider, if you will, that in the context of a battle, Abner killed Joab's brother. Second of all, Abner tried twice to avoid the conflict. In our country, if I told somebody, you come one step further, I'm going to shoot you, and then they come one step further, what do we call that? Self-defense. And I understand that the Old Testament law has very different rules. But in Numbers 35, you'll find no mention of whether battle plays a part in this or not. You'll find no mention of whether warning the person not to do so and so matters or not. I would make the case that at least to some extent, what Abner did was not murder. But what Joab did to Abner was. Because he knew that peace had been made because he was told that before he pursued Abner. Now, he didn't believe it, he didn't agree with it, but he had been told that peace had been made. And David, if we believe David at his word, says he needs to be put to death because he shed blood in peacetime. David is saying that what he did to Abner and Amasa is murder. Now, David may be wrong, but the other really interesting thing, and I brought up Judges earlier for this one point. In the time of the Judges, everyone did what was right in their own eyes because why? There was no king. What do we have now? A king. When a king says there's peace, is he right? When he makes peace on behalf of the people, is that binding? Yeah. So when David said that there's peace with Abner, was there peace with Abner? I mean, in every political sense, certainly. And so for David to say that that was shedding blood in peacetime or murder, that to me tells me what I need to know about that particular part. I had the thought about the Avenger of Blood also, and so I spent some time digging on that. The second thing, is it right, by the way, the Avenger of Blood, that was right under Old Testament law, correct? That was obeying the law. Oh, sure, you could not do it. And there was the context of going out to the murderer could go to a city of refuge and be allowed to stay there. As long as he stayed there till the death of the high priest, he was safe. It's like a basin tag. Not necessarily. And so, I only made so many slides. I trimmed. He hits him with the blunt end of the spear, which is something that, again, if this was a murder trial, I would make that case. He didn't even try to hit him with the pointy end. Like, we all understand how spears work, right? Pointy end goes into the other man, right? Like, well, and immediately preceding that, they actually had a contest where each of them sent 10 young men to fight to entertain them. Okay? Take that for what you will. Suffice to say, David says that what he did was wrong. I'm going to go with David on this one, because again, he's the judge. And again, that's why I brought up the whole there was no king in Israel in Judges, but there is now. The second thing, obeying the word of the king. You should do that, right? Well, in 2 Samuel 11, in the case of Bathsheba, David sent a letter. To who? Joab. Put Uriah where the fighting is fiercest up near the wall, and then withdraw from him so that he dies. Does Joab, in recorded scripture, you can wonder if there's a subtext or whatever else, does Joab ask any questions about those instructions? No. I mentioned 2 Samuel 23 several times. David's mighty men. You know who the last one is? Last one on that list. Uriah the Hittite. This wasn't just some unknown grunt, okay? There's 37 in all, and Uriah the Hittite makes the list. Among David's soldiers, he is specifically recognized. So he's not unknown to David, he is not unknown to Joab. And when David tells Joab, I want you to set him up to die, Joab goes, okay. I understand you need to obey the voice of the king, but Joab's going to show later in the story he has no problem challenging David. And furthermore, when he sends the message back, just to drive home the point, he tells the messenger, when the king is upset that we got so close to the wall, be sure and tell him your servant Uriah the Hittite is dead. So Joab, in full knowledge and intentional of carrying out the king's plan, murdered Uriah. I mean, he didn't drive the blade through himself, but he absolutely set the stage for it. Right or wrong? Most of you don't have any problem saying that's wrong, right? He did what the king said. That everything's fine. Okay? Now we're going to find out that in this case, God's going to come to David and go, this is not fine. And that'll be somebody else's point to cover because I have 3 minutes left. The last part, he had a job. His job was to lead the king's army. Right? Did he carry out his job? Yeah. As a matter of fact, he was exceptional. Sign him up for a raise and a promotion. He is very good at it. Until it's not his job anymore. And so what he does is, again, for one of 3 reasons, at least in my mind, murders his replacement. Now, he's good at his job. But David demoted him. Right or wrong to murder Amasa? Did it matter that he was good at his job? Did that make killing his replacement okay? No. So the reason I put these 3 things up there, and there's several other you could do, is that there's some right things that Joab does. But in the first one, he's not really carrying out the law so much as he's just doing what he wants. In the second one, he's challenged David before, but not this time. That's fine. We'll kill Uriah. Okay. Suits him fine. And lastly, leads the king's army until it's no longer his job. So he just kills his replacement because it suits him fine. Joab consistently abides by the law and then doesn't, obeys the king and then doesn't, does what seems reasonable and then doesn't. He's a real human. I like that. It's a good comment. But the other thing that he is exactly what he's condemned for. Are we at war today? As the church, let me clarify. As the church, are we at war? Can we nod for this? Or we're at war, right? 2 Corinthians 10, 4 and 5 talks about how our battle is not against flesh and blood. But make no mistake, it's a battle. Ephesians 6, 10 through 17, that's a lot of equipment for people that aren't at war. And there's several analogies that Paul uses, but fighting is one of them. We're at war. But here's the question, do we know how to be at peace? Romans chapter 12, verse 18. Does anybody know what it says? As much as it concerns you, live at peace with all men. But we're at war. But we're not at war with men. Who are we at war with? Satan. So, can we fight that war and still be at peace with all men? Absolutely. Do we do that? James 3, 17 and 18. Somebody turn there for me, please. I haven't had anybody read all night. Just this one time I'm going to have somebody read. James 3, 17 and 18.
But wisdom from above is first pure and peaceable, gentle, reasonable, full of mercy and good fruits, unwavering, without hypocrisy.
Wisdom from above is first pure. What does that mean? What does it mean for something to be pure? Uncontaminated, unaltered, untainted. Wisdom from above is first pure. Now, Joab had a particular kind of wisdom, the kind that the psalmist and Proverbs writer would say leads to death. This is exactly why he got killed. He had a particular worldly kind of wisdom. He played politics and war really well. But the wisdom that's from above is first pure. If we're going to be honest with ourselves, we as Christians in 2023 need to understand something. We are at war. However, we are not at war with each other. Right? As much as we like to fight, and as much as we love to battle the good battle, war the good warfare, as much as we like that, we also have to be good at peace. If we have the pure kind of wisdom that comes from above, we need to have peace with each other and peace with those around us. Because the rest of that about mercy, what about that? Are we good at that? Here's the thing that I see in Joab's story, and with this we'll close the class. I'll open for comments for about 30 seconds if anybody wants it, but all your kids are already out, so now you know. Joab was good at fighting. He was good at war. He didn't understand what it meant to make an enemy a friend, to make an enemy an ally. Here's my challenge to us. Let's learn to discern the difference between friend and foe. And then second of all, when we're able to make a foe a friend, let's treat them as such. Because Joab is terrible at that. And it is for that reason, that shedding blood in peacetime, the fact that he could not ever turn off what he thought he was good at. And some of us are good at warring. This is sharper than any two-edged sword, right? But what else is it? It's a lamp to our feet. It's a light to our path. It's a candle that's not under a basket, but instead put on a table so that the whole house can see it. So if you were lost in the woods and you saw somebody waving a sword around, would you go towards them? What if you saw somebody holding up a light? We have to learn what it means to be at war and what it means to be at peace and when the two are appropriate. That's what Joab fails at. So that's my call to action for tonight. Any comments or anything this evening? I appreciate it. You guys have a great week.